The Protestant Reformation was one of the biggest movements in Europe, and many of the results of the movement still affect the world today. The dates most commonly given to the Reformation are 1517, which was the year of the posting of the 95 Theses, until 1648, which was the year of the Treaty of Westphalia and the end of the religious wars. But I will not be getting into the religious wars during this podcast. There were many things going on leading up to the Protestant Reformation. The Reformation was supported by people who disliked their reigning governmental authority and both city dwellers and villagers. Because of the new printing press, there was an increase in books and libraries which increased people's literacy and curiosity. People were frustrated with the members of clergy who were exempt from taxes and exempt from jurisdiction of civil courts. The effects of events like the Great Schism, the Avignon Papacy, and the Conciliar movement were very important because of the Catholic Church and the Pope lost their prestige. It was a very confusing time, and people felt the Church was separating and losing religious focus. With common people becoming more intelligent, nations growing, and the Pope already losing influences, the Protestant movement came at a perfect time. One of the three, and probably the most famous of the leaders of the Protestant Reformation, was Martin Luther from Germany, who founded Lutheranism. Martin Luther had many ideas, one being justification by faith alone. He was bothered with the Catholic belief that stated good works got you to heaven, because he was distraught with the level of his own sinfulness and the perfect righteousness that medieval theology taught that God required for salvation. Luther believed that believing in God is what got you to heaven, not doing good deeds. Another major disagreement Luther had with the Catholic Church was the selling of indulgences. Indulgences are essentially things sold by the Church that people buy to get rid of their sins. They started during the Crusades, because family members were upset when crusaders would die during war without completing their penances, so the Church sold them indulgences. However, during this time they were dispensed regularly. Luther disagreed because they gave the Pope more power that he didn't deserve, as he was essentially in charge of whose sins would be forgiven. Luther believed that indulgences did not really clean someone of their sins, and the money raised from the indulgences was simply going to the Pope and Albrecht, the Augsburg banking house of Fugger. Martin Luther famously posted his 95 Theses, which attacked the selling of indulgences in 1517. 2 years later, Luther challenged the infallibility of the Pope and inerrancy of church councils during a debate. He also appealed to the sovereign authority of Scripture alone for the first time. Luther was then condemned for heresy and later excommunicated. He was told to retract his teachings at the Diet of Worms, but he did not. Luther would flee before a decision was made, and he disappeared. Another important thing to remember about Luther's time was the Peasants' Revolt in 1524 to 1525. Peasants revolted against their masters because of Luther's teachings, but he did not support the revolution. Although Luther supported the poor in general, he did not support the revolt against their masters. If he had supported their revolt, it would have contradicted his teachings and possibly ended the chance of his reform surviving. Another major leader of the Protestant Reformation was Ulrich Zwingli, who was highly influenced by the humanist Erasmus. Zwingli was in Switzerland, which was made up of 13 autonomous states at the time. Some were Catholic, some Protestant, and some were a compromise of both. Zwingli agreed with some of Luther's ideas, such as disagreeing with indulgences. Some of Zwingli's other ideas were ending clerical celibacy so members of the clergy could get married, and that whatever lacks scriptural support should not be believed nor practiced. In turn, he disagreed with Luther, who believed communion was Jesus in the flesh. Because that lacked scriptural support, Zwingli believed communion was symbolic. Under Zwingli and his ideas of harsh discipline, the city of Zurich became one of the first examples of puritanical Protestantism. Zwingli died later in a Swiss civil war between the divided areas of Protestantism and Catholicism. Something important to note is the radical Protestant groups that believed the pace of the Lutheran and Zwinglian Reformation was too slow and moderate. These groups include the Anabaptists, the Spiritualists, and the Anti-Trinitarians. The third major leader of the Protestant Reformation was John Calvin of Geneva. One of his ideas was predestination, which meant that it was already decided if you were going to heaven or not before you were even born. He also believed in the individual's responsibility to reorder society according to God's plan. He inspired political resistance in France, the Netherlands, and Scotland. Calvinism took over as the dominant Protestant force in Europe instead of Lutheranism in the second half of the 16th century. Now we are going to shift our focus on some of the reactions of monarchs to this movement, specifically that of Charles V. One major event was the Diet of Augsburg, which was run by Charles V. The meeting was supposed to make a settlement of religious divisions between Protestants and Catholics, but instead it ordered all Lutherans to revert to Catholicism. The Reformation was too established for this to work. Lutherans formed a defensive alliance called the Schmalkaldic League, and Charles V became distracted by war with France and the Turks. Meanwhile, education reforms were made in Germany, and the Reformation spread into Denmark and Sweden, which both embraced Lutheranism. In addition, Poland, which lacked a central political authority, became religiously tolerant to Lutherans, Anabaptists, Calvinists, and even anti-Trinitarians. Eventually, Charles V decided to take a different approach. He sent imperial armies which crushed the Schmalkaldic League and issued the Augsburg Interim, which ordered Protestants everywhere to readopt Catholic beliefs and practices. This sent many Protestant leaders into exile. This event eventually led into the Peace of Augsburg. The Protestant armies gained ground against Charles V, who was weary from prior decades of war. In 1552, he issued the Peace of Passau, which reinstated Protestant leaders and guaranteed Lutheran religious freedom. This action was symbolic to Charles V, surrendering his lifelong quest of European religious unity. 3 years later, in 1555, the Peace of Augsburg made the division of Christendom permanent. It is important to note that Calvinism was not recognized as a legal religion in the Peace of Augsburg. Now, I will be talking about the English Reformation. England did not necessarily go through everything that mainland Europe went through. Things went differently on the island of England. Henry VIII was married to Catherine of Aragon, who gave him ties to Spain because she was the daughter of Ferdinand and Isabella. However, he wanted to divorce her because she did not produce a male heir. However, this was not allowed by the Catholic religion. Then, in what is now called the Reformation Parliament, the Act of Succession and the Act of Supremacy was made. The Act of Succession made the children of Anne Boleyn, the woman Henry VIII wanted to marry, legitimate heirs to the throne. The more important Act of Supremacy made Henry VIII the only supreme head in earth of the Church of England. Thus, the Anglican Church was founded. Eventually, Anne Boleyn was executed for alleged treason and adultery, and her child was now declared an illegitimate heir. Henry VIII went on to have 4 more marriages. An important side note is Henry's 6 articles of 1539, which were inspired by his anger from the growing popularity of Protestant views. These articles were referred to by Protestants as the whip with 6 stings. After Henry's death, the 6 articles of 1539 were repealed, and his son Edward VI, who was 10 years old, took over the throne. England took full advantage and fully enacted the Protestant Reformation after Henry's death. Many of the Protestant leaders who fled to England after the Augsburg Interim played a major role after Henry's death. Finally, the Catholic Church decided to cease trying to stomp out the Protestants altogether and to just try to stop it from spreading. This started the Catholic Counter-Reformation. Ignatius of Loyola founded the Jesuits and started spiritual exercises, which were mental and emotional exercises for spiritual self-mastery. They actually won back many Protestants back to Catholicism. Another major event was the Council of Trent. The council made many reforms regarding internal church discipline. It strengthened the authority of local bishops so they could effectively discipline popular religious practice. The bishops were also required to reside in their areas and be highly visible and noticeable. They gave the priest a brighter image by requiring him to be better dressed and educated, along with being strictly celibate. It's important to note that not a single doctrinal concession was made to the Protestants in the Council of Trent. Many of the ideas of the Protestant Reformation went hand in hand with the humanist teachings. They wanted commoners to be better educated so that they could understand what was being done to them. Education started to improve throughout Europe, and the lower class became better aware. In addition to that, the Reformation viewed women differently than they had been viewed throughout history. They viewed women as extremely important, and not only domestically. Luther wrote, "Imagine what it would be like without women. The home, cities, economic life, and government would virtually disappear. Men cannot do without women. Even if it were possible for men to beget and bear children, they still cannot do without women." The ideal of the companion marriage started. Women now had an equal right with men to divorce and remarry in good conscience. The Protestant Reformation was one of the biggest and most influential movements in Europe, and many of its ideas are still in effect today.